Friends, fellow Ohioans, listeners around the state, welcome to Talk of Ohio with PG Sittenfeld. I'm your host, PG Sittenfeld, who is making news and making waves today. So glad you are with us for the next half hour. I am a Cincinnati city councilman by day, but for the next half hour, just here to be part of the conversation as we broadcast on News Talk 1490 WERE in Cleveland and 1230 WDBZ The Buzz in Cincinnati. And when it comes to state and national issues, we have got you covered. Always want to introduce my co-pilot here in studio, my right-hand woman. How you doing, Tamaya Denard?
I am excellent.
I'm excellent, too. It's always nice to be in your company. And we got an important show topic for us today. This is something that it's been fascinating for me to watch the sort of, how conversations come to take root and burrow in people's brains. And, I think a lot of it says is what's the President of the United States talking about? I think so much of what we're thinking about can flow from there. And that topic is income inequality, right? That we are increasingly becoming a culture of haves and have-nots, and the have-nots are getting more and more pinched. And meanwhile, you have sort of the Koch brothers on the other end. It feels like trying to rig the system. So we want to talk about income inequality in general and the minimum wage specifically. And we're delighted to welcome to Talk of Ohio Tim Burga, president of the Ohio AFL-CIO. Tim, welcome to Talk of Ohio.
Hi, PG and Tamara. How are you?
Hi.
Good. We appreciate you joining us. And, as I sort of said, before we get to the topic of the minimum wage, income inequality more broadly, the president said, again, the defining issue of our time. What do you think we need to do? Because obviously I like the fact that people are talking about this, that people are thinking about it, that we're more conscious that this is a real problem morally, economically, for a variety of reasons. But what do we do to sort of seize the moment and turn this conversation into action?
Well, we applaud the president for elevating this conversation. There's not many more important topics than to talk about an economy that's gone wrong and an economy that rewards only those at the very top and leaves the rest of the workers behind. Let's start with the tremendous amount of wealth that's being created in this country. Some would argue wealth that we haven't seen ever in our nation's history. And while that's going on, consider that the top 1% of all Americans are earning and taking home 25% of all the income.
So I just want to repeat that because it is a pretty glaring, startling statistic. The top 1% of all Americans are taking home a quarter of all the income.
Yeah, and Ohioans and Americans, don't begrudge wealth, but
there's
a fairness question about that.
Well, we want everyone to have the same shot at wealth, right? Not just the rich get richer. And to sort of, I guess, extend on the statistic, the powerful statistic that you just shared. I think I saw that in the next 20 years or by 2050 or at some point, the top 1%, if things keep going the way they are on track to take home 50% of the income. And I think, at a certain point, it boils down to a values question because I cheer for people to make money and to create jobs, but making sure that it's not at the expense of other people, including half the population.
Well, there's no question about that. Let me throw out another statistic here that plays to this narrative why the president has been so forceful about having a conversation about wages. 5% of all Americans are controlling 63% of all the wealth in this country. We haven't seen statistics like this since the 1920s, and we know how that turned out with the stock market crash and the Great Depression. So we're at a very precarious place in our nation's history. Workers are getting left behind in historic numbers, and again, an economy that's rewarding only those at the very top. And we need to focus again. I think the president's trying to grab national attention here to focus on building an economy from the middle out.
Well, and again, I think the important point here is that folks can have whatever sort of moral thinking or position they want. But this also, what you just described, where things are and where they're headed, that's not a healthy economy. And this isn't PG Sittenfeld's opinion. This is, long economic research. The economy is healthy when there is broad prosperity, when there is a strong and growing middle class. And what we're talking about is the opposite of that. So, obviously, I think one of the proposals that the president is certainly putting a lot of energy behind that I absolutely support and that you've been a leader of sort of in the past, going back to, if we time travel back to the middle of the last decade, the fight to raise the minimum wage here in Ohio. I guess give us a bit of a refresher on how that campaign unfolded because you were so instrumental and why ultimately you think it succeeded.
Well, sure, PG. Yeah, the Ohio AFL-CIO and then State Senator C.J. Prentice was instrumental in having a statewide conversation about raising the minimum wage at a time when the federal minimum wage was $5.15 an hour and had not been raised in 11 years. So we thought
if I can, I'm not the world's most brilliant mathematician, but if you're talking about a wage of around $5 an hour, go ahead and multiply that by 2,000 hours a year. Asking someone to subsist on $10,000, I mean, no one can keep a straight face and say, "Yeah, go support yourself, go support a family, taking home $10,000." Yeah. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but sometimes it's important for folks to step back and say, "Let's do the math here."
Well, it puts gas in the car, and that's about it.
And not
right
much
now.
more, right?
So we thought, let's take it to the voters of the state of Ohio to see if they would like to take the minimum wage out of the hands of politicians. And what I mean by that was...
No offense taken, I promise.
Right. Well, there's a lot of public service representatives that want to do the right thing, but too often, as it relates to minimum wage, when you look at it historically, we find ourselves 10 years down the road without a minimum wage increase.
Right.
So we said, let's take it to the ballot as a constitutional amendment. Let Ohioans decide if they would like to index the minimum wage in the state of Ohio to the rate of inflation. And we pegged the minimum wage rate at the time at $6.85. It's currently at $7.95 and $3.98 for tipped employees. Not enough, but what we did was, at least in Ohio, we progressively, and we're one of the few states that have done this, have taken raising the minimum wage for our minimum wage workers in Ohio out of the hands of the politicians, and as the consumer price index goes up, so too shall that minimum wage raise. But we've got a lot of work to do, as the president has been making sure everybody's aware of.
Well, I think it's huge, and I think you all had great foresight tying it to CPI so that it wasn't sort of stagnant, but even still, I think we're starting to see it's actually not keeping up with what it takes to sort of be able to support yourself, support a family, let alone, have the opportunity to save and to get ahead. But thinking about the example of, because this went to the citizens of Ohio, what was the margin by which it passed? Remind us of that.
Well, it was a double-digit victory, which in Ohio is considered a landslide.
And just out of curiosity, because maybe sort of, past example we'll learn from and implement again in the future, why do you think it was so successful at the ballot that year?
Well, because there's this great anxiety about the haves and the have-nots that you've laid out, about workers in the state of Ohio who just want to play by the rules, work hard, and be able to take care of their kids, save a little bit for a dignified retirement, take a vacation occasionally, buy a house, and, live what used to be the American dream. Now, when we look at 2006 to compare to where we are 8 years from now, there's even a greater concern now because we've got nowhere for not just kids in high school and kids right out of high school, but we've got adults now with nowhere to go but service sector and retail sector jobs making minimum wage or just above. Our economy has been devastated with trade and tax policy that has outsourced our manufacturing base, which created a whole tidal wave and rippled downstream of our economy. So we're not just talking about, kids and young adults. We're talking about adults and adults with dependent children that are working in these low-wage jobs, and it's just inconceivable that they could get by on this.
Well, on a couple points, I mean, I think it's really important, the things you mentioned about someone every once in a while, maybe they can take a vacation, maybe they can buy their grandchild a birthday gift. I mean, when we talk about going from $5.75 to $8 to $10.10, which is what the president's proposing, folks, no one's getting rich off this, right? This is just a little opportunity to do the things that anyone would like to be able to do, some of the basics in their life. So, when you sort of hear the opposition push back on those things, and again, I think another thing along the same line that's really important to emphasize is these are folks that are going out and working every day, right? They're waking up, they're catching the early bus, they're working 2 jobs, sometimes 3 jobs. So I think it's important in this whole conversation, this is rewarding work. This is making work pay. This isn't a handout. We're saying it's important that, dignity be reflected in someone's paycheck at the end of the day.
I mean, what's inconceivable for me is to see people who work hard and you see them working hard and can't
They're falling behind
to put food on their table. And it's not, and you gave the number of the $5 an hour, a few years ago to $10,000, don't have children. I mean, this is just like if you have children, forget about it.
Well, so Tim, I'm not trying to put the weight of the world on your shoulders here, but even though the constitutional amendment that you all put in, raising the minimum wage in Ohio, was tied to inflation, is it time to raise the minimum wage in Ohio again?
Well, you hit on something very important. I mean, let's look at some of the wealthiest corporations in America and in the world are corporations where we have the predominant number of low-wage workers. Mm-hmm. McDonald's, I'm not picking on any companies here, but McDonald's and Walmart and others. let's take a look as an example of and do some comparison. Minimum wage in Ohio is $7.95 an hour, or $3.98 if you're a tipped employee. The average worker in the state of Ohio is making $18.77 per hour. The average CEO of our top 100 Ohio companies, their hourly wage rate, if you calculate it out, would be $2,740 an hour, or 370 times higher than the $7.95 minimum wage rate.
Does that reflect our values as a society? And again, it's so important to remind folks, we're not saying no one should be able to get rich, but we're just saying, let's not have a totally divided culture where, the 1% rules and everyone else is left behind. Let's have pathways of opportunity for everybody.
Tim, we're not, we're like you, we're not picking on any particular companies or organizations, but for people who say, I don't want minimum wage to be increased because I don't want my hamburger to go up, or I don't want my, my Clorox to cost more. What do you say when people say, when just a regular Joe Schmoes, when they say that they don't want minimum wage to be increased because of that? What's your response?
Well, don't take my word for it, Tamira. I mean, let's look at labor economists all over the country. Most recent study at the California Berkeley Institution, where they took a look at, again, I'm not picking on Walmart, but there's tend to be a pretty easy target on.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. There are some things about Walmart to pick on, so we won't begrudge it.
They say, let's take a look at raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour as a starting point, where in Congress there's a bill, a Harkin-Miller bill, to do just that. They say, let's do that. What would that mean to the cost of the product, and what would that mean to the cost of jobs? This study found, and we're talking about nonpartisan economists here, that it would add less than 1% to Walmart's annual labor bill. Now, translate that out on what it means to consumers, would amount to about a penny for a $16 item. And so there's the cost effect of this is a red herring. It's negligible. All the economists will tell you that.
Well, and Tim, if I can add sort of one other data point on this, there's an economist, Sarah Lemos, who recently reviewed the literature, sort of, vast amounts of studies, and found that a 10% increase in the minimum wage would correlate to no more than a 0.4% rise in prices. 0.4, not 4%, 0.4%. So, again, a lot of research to debunk that. And then you were going to talk about another one of the sort of, false myths that I think the other side likes to perpetuate, and that's, this is going to cost jobs, and they try and take you back to Econ 101. If you make something more expensive, you're going to get less of it. I'm sorry, but that's just not what the research reflects.
The research doesn't reflect that. Let's go back to 2006. We heard all those arguments during the campaign to raise the wage, and it mostly coming from the restaurant industry and the retail industry, and it just didn't happen. In fact, Bloomberg News, right, which is not necessarily considered a worker media platform, right, looking at U.S. Department of Labor information, charted minimum wage increases going back to 1990 in correlation with specifically restaurant industry job loss gains, found no impact whatsoever. And what they found is that when you're putting money into the hands of people who are most definitely going to spend it, the economy goes directly back into the economy. So it's actually helping Main Street business.
Right, it's helpful for the economy. One other thing, we recently had the director of the UC Economics Center, a very well-respected institution here in Cincinnati, say, and this is a direct quote from an op-ed she wrote in the Cincinnati Enquirer, 2 very recent meta-analyses, so studies of many studies, examined almost 100 research studies. The results, minimum wage increases have little, if any, effect on employment. That's a direct quote from the director of the UC Economics Center. So, in terms of thinking about, who is against this, I was interested. I saw a clip of Bill O'Reilly supports raising the minimum wage. I know. I don't like to agree with Bill O'Reilly on almost anything, but he might have this one right. And then, interestingly, in California, where they're talking about trying to raise the minimum wage, the person spearheading that campaign is a conservative libertarian, and he's coming at it. I'm more coming at this from a sort of, moral and economic standpoint, that let's have an honest day's work be rewarded with a fair wage. He's saying let's reduce overall government subsidy by having less people be dependent because they're not getting that fair wage. But what do you think is the